When spring fly fishing rolls around, it's always a good idea to have a wide selection of mayflies and midges on hand just to match whatever hatch might come your way. And in a lot of situations, those flies we all hear about, the parachute Adams, the Griffiths gnat, the pheasant tail, they work just fine. But then you run into the fish that's just completely had it, like the toddler who missed his nap for yet another trip to Target. I can't help with the parenting, but I can give you tools to tame those trout tantrums. This week on Untangled, I'll share a list of flies that don't get the credit they deserve. When the chips are down and the fish aren't cooperating, these are the flies I turn to. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. A few weeks ago, I did a show about 14 of the must-have spring fly patterns. And the flies we're going to talk about today, they don't replace that list. That list is still 100% valid. The flies we're talking about today just add to it. They spice that list up. They're the secret sauce, if you will. And other than the sparkle dun, I'm not going to discuss a lot of our common spring flies today. So your last chance cripple, your Griffiths gnat, your parachute Adams, the Jujubatus, a lot of our midge patterns, our spring streamers. We're not discussing that on today's show because that's not what this show is about. We're breaking new ground here today at Untangled. We're going off the reservation. We are going down the rabbit hole of parenting advice from Reddit, to go back to that toddler metaphor from earlier. Only, unlike the parenting advice from Reddit, the chances of going to jail for using the flies on this list is almost non-existent. Now, this list is Dryfly and Emerger heavy because those are the flies that really turn the day around for me most often, because trout get the pickiest in the spring when they're eating off the top. And I know that when I started fly fishing, learning to fish dries was probably the hardest thing. That kicked my butt more than most, especially dry flies during spring, like what we're going through right now. And I'm still no expert at it. I've just failed a lot, so I have a lot of examples of what not to do. And this list was born from a lot of that trial and error. And hopefully it goes without saying as well that I don't think this list is revolutionary, or that I'm talking about completely unknown flies that I dredged up from the darkest corners of the dark web, like the flater mouse or the sofa pillow, which those are real patterns, by the way. These are just flies that I reckon get overlooked in the general scheme of spring fly fishing. So let's get right into it. Start off with probably my favorite fly ever, the sparkle dun. I honestly don't know if the sparkle dun gets enough love. In fact, I think the English language just doesn't contain the adjectives worthy of describing the greatness and the grandeur of the sparkle dun. It's just such a good fly. I believe in it strongly. I feel very confident when I fish it, and it just produces for me consistently. I fished the fire hole last fall, right before the park closed there in Yellowstone, and end of the season, those fish have seen probably 10,000 flies at least. Those fish have just been hammered. They're very picky, and it was a late season Bluewinged hatch. I was there with a friend of mine, and he was kind of getting his butt kicked, and I was getting my butt kicked. But the 3 or 4 fish that I caught all came on that sparkle dun because it just works. Now, what exactly is the sparkle dun? Well, it is primarily an emerger pattern, but I think fish eat it sometimes as a cripple as well. And just for those who aren't aware, your aquatic insects go through this life cycle where they start out their life as a nymph. They're living underwater. They're just doing little underwater insect things. And then when they are ready to become an adult, they transform into this emerger stage. Now, that emerger will swim up from the bottom of the river, and it will try to get up to the surface where they can hatch into an adult. And as they're moving up through the water, they start to change. Their body shape changes. Their behavior changes a little bit. And then when they do manage to get up to the surface, they have to shed their nymphal shuck. It's like a snake shedding its skin almost. And they will get stuck in the surface film of the water because they're trying to get rid of the nymph shuck. They're trying to dry their wings off so they can fly away. And then once they've fully hatched, they sit there on top of the water, again, letting their wings dry off for a minute. And that's when you see, with mayflies specifically, you see that sailboat silhouette of the mayfly sitting on top of the water. And then once their wings are dry, they get up, they fly away, they mate, they come back to the water and lay their eggs. So that's the aquatic insect life cycle in very brief detail. But that emerger phase, when they're moving up to go hatch, and then when they're stuck in the surface film, that's what the sparkle dun imitates. But I also think it imitates a cripple as well. And a cripple, all that is it's exactly what it sounds like. It's an adult bug that has something wrong with it. Maybe a wing didn't form right. Maybe the legs are broken. Maybe it's still stuck in its nymphal shuck a little bit. There's just something going on with it to where it can't fly away. And fish see that and they think, ooh, that's a full adult. It can't escape me. They run and they smack that. They love the cripples because they're an easy meal that has a very small chance of getting away. Same reason they love the emergers. The emergers are stuck. Their wings don't work yet. The fish key in on that and see it as an easy meal that has a very low chance of escaping them. So with the sparkle dun, this is my go-to during our spring mayfly hatches. And I tie it up as the second fly in a double dryfly rig, usually behind a parachute blue-winged olive or a parachute Adams, just depending on the size and color of the blue wings that are coming off that day. I usually don't put floatant on my sparkle duns. I just let them sink. And then I watch for that dryfly to move. And if the dryfly moves or if it goes under, then I know something ate that sparkle dun. Sometimes I'll put just a little bit of that powder floatant on the sparkle dun if I'm in really riffly water, or if I'm having a really hard time seeing the takes. I'll put a little bit of that powder floatant on because I found that can help sometimes. I do like tying these in 16s and 18s, and then I've got a wide variety of colors that I tie them in as well. I've got the usual Adams gray, the blue-winged olive, but then I've also got some with rusty bodies as well. I think those rusty bodies work very well when there's a lot of bugs on the water, because I think that rust color stands out, creates a little bit more contrast, and I think the fish just see it better. I don't really have anything to back that up other than my experience and my gut, but that's what my gut is telling me is the reason that those rusty ones work so well. So that's your sparkle dun. Go buy like 5,000 of these flies because they're just so stinking good. The next fly in our list is going to be the Clinkhammer. Now, the Clinkhammer is great because it has the virtue of probably being the easiest emerger pattern to see. Now, that's because it's basically a parachute fly that has been tied on a curved nymph hook. So a little bit more than half of this dryfly actually sits below the surface, but then that parachute post sticks straight up. It is super easy to see. So if you have a hard time seeing your flies and you need some emerger patterns that you can actually see, the Clinkhammer is a great option to turn to. I really don't see or hear people fishing Clinkhammers very much. The folks I run with, they just don't fish Clinkhammers very much. I know in certain areas they're very, very popular. I just don't see a whole ton of them out here, which is a shame because they really are just a beautiful, beautiful little fly. And especially if the fish are making soft, subtle emerger rises, the clink can be a great fly to throw. Because if it seems like the fish are a little scared to completely break the surface, that clink is just a great fly. They can come up and sip without breaking the surface completely. Maybe they're feeling a little scared or self-conscious or whatever, but it can help out when the fish are behaving like that. I like my Clinkhammers in 16s, and then I usually tie them all with synthetic materials. I don't do dubbed bodies. I just do like synthetic quill bodies because they tend to last a little bit longer, and I like the lifelike appearance of it as well. Our next fly on the list is going to be your foam wing emerger. Now, this is an interesting little fly because you can fish it two ways. You can film it. You can fish it as a true stuck in the film emerger, but you've got to add a lot of floatant to it to make that happen because this fly has no hackle. But it is honestly fished best when you just let it sink and settle into that top third of the water column, because at that point, it's imitating that emerger that is moving up through the water, like we discussed earlier. It's not quite a true emerger yet. It wants to get out there. It wants to unfurl its wings. It's got the learner's permit, but not the driver's license yet. That's a good way to think of that life stage. And if the fish aren't rising consistently, or if they're not rising at all, despite the fact that there's a bunch of duns on the surface, a bunch of those adults on the surface, then a sunken emerger like this can just turn the fishing on, because there's a very good chance that the fish just haven't started eating the adults because there's still so many emergers underneath that. Why would they break the surface to eat a fly, which is more work, and that fly could potentially escape them when they could just sit there and eat the stuff that's still underwater? So that can be a very effective fly when you fish it that way. I like these in 18s and 20s. I do like them a little bit smaller. They just seem to work better for me in those sizes. Our next fly is the Antonio's Bluewinged Olive Emerger. Now, you might be asking yourself, Durant, you've talked about 3 emerger patterns already today. Why do we have so many emerger patterns? Why do I walk into a fly shop and see an entire wall of emerger patterns? What gives with that? Can someone explain that to me? Well, I'll attempt to. One of the reasons that we have so many emerger patterns, your sparkle duns, your parachute emergers, your clinks, your foam wings, everything else that you see, is that I've found, and I think this is, you see this borne out in fisheries all across the country, that fish can develop a taste for a certain body shape, a certain body style, or even an entire silhouette of a certain fly. Now, I'm sure the real reason for this is that some of these emergers more closely mimic the real life bugs on a certain river. And because not every river is the same, bugs might vary just a little bit from river to river. So the fish want a little bit of a different presentation. But I'm convinced that the fish decide to only eat a certain style of emerger just to mess with us. They have a pre-hatch meeting and they decide that today and today only, they're eating the Antonio's emerger, of which you only have 2, and you will promptly lose 1 to a bad hook set. They love to mess with us like that. I'm convinced of it. Now, the Antonio's Bluewinged Olive Emerger makes a smaller silhouette on the water. It's a smaller fly. It sits a little bit lower than other emerger patterns. It really does ride that film, kind of similar to the Clinkhammer, but it does have a taller wing than some other emerger patterns, so it's a little bit easier to see. Again, a wide variety of emergers is key, because sometimes the fish just want something different than the same pattern that everyone's been fishing. And sometimes just a little bit different, not completely straying. You don't want to be the guy in the middle of a bluewing hatch throwing a royal wolf, because that's too different. But a little bit different sometimes can be all you need to make that switch. And I like these particular flies in a size 18. Our next fly is the MicroMay. This is a little nymph, and I've found it to be very effective when the fish are hyper-focused on mayflies. And a classic like the Catis or even a pheasant tail just doesn't seem to be cutting it. Or maybe you need to get the nymph down deeper. And since the Catis is tied unweighted, it can be hard to get that down without adding tons of split shot. And then you're probably fishing a dry dropper rig at that point, so you're concerned about dragging the dry down. The MicroMay has a very similar profile, but it's got a bead on it, so it sinks. It's very slim fly, so it really just gets down there. It's a great fly to switch to if the fish have seen a ton of pheasant tails or Frenchies or even Perdigons. Perdigons are very good during these early hatches. In fact, I was out on the water yesterday and I was sight fishing to trout that were sitting in on the edge of the runs. And there was a little bit of a midge hatch and a tiny little bit of a mayfly hatch going on. And the Perdigon did work for me. I caught all the fish on Perdigons. So they are great to have on hand, but that's one of your classic flies, right? How many people have the MicroMay? Everybody's got a Perdigon. The MicroMay, just a little bit different. And again, sometimes that just slight difference can really make or break your success on the water. Our next fly is the Catfish Emerger. Now, sometimes we get hyper focused on mayflies during spring, and that's very understandable because this is their time to shine. The mayflies take center stage other than fall, and they get most of the attention. They're always out and about. But caddis will start moving in late spring. And if you overlook the caddis opportunities, you're missing some opportunities to catch fish. Now, this Catis Emerger, it's great for use up on top. You can fish it just like you would a sparkle dun or any other emerger where you just let it sink a little bit below the surface. But I've also done very well fishing this deep as the bottom fly in a nymph rig because this emerger's unweighted. So once it sinks, that heavier fly drags it down, and then it can kind of bounce and move through the current. And with the current, it makes it look very lifelike, like I imagine a Catis Emerger actually would look. And I like these in a size 16. The CDC Catis is next to continue our appreciation of these bugs during spring. I've found that it can pay to switch up from our usual elk hair caddis that everybody fishes. During the spring, especially when the fish are picky, there's just something about this CDC Catis, the way it sits on the water. Maybe it's just a little bit different of a silhouette from the elk hair that the fish seem to like. But if they are being picky, it's a great option to have. It's a good thing to have in your box for those moments. It's relatively easy to tie as well. It floats just fine. And then it does make a very realistic silhouette on the water. I like these in 14s all the way down to 18s during the spring. And then I will fish CDC Catis throughout the rest of the year as well. But they really make their first appearance for me in the spring. Our next fly is the Jigged Prince Nymph. This is a fly that I got introduced to last year. Alex actually reintroduced me to Prince Nymphs. I fished them a whole bunch when I was learning to fly fish. And then I kind of moved away from them, and I don't know why. Because I talked about this on a recent episode as well. Prince Nymph is fantastic. It is such a good fly. It is very effective. It just seems to get the job done. And I don't think that many people fish Prince Nymphs anymore. I think it's viewed as an old school fly, and a lot of times we doubt the efficacy of these old school flies, but where the Prince Nymph is concerned, you shouldn't do that because it is fantastic. And when you take the Prince, but you put it on a jig hook, you give a lot more life and movement to this classic pattern. It makes it work even better because you've got the hackle around it that pulsates and moves, and I think the jig hook gives that even more action. I like my jigged princes on freestone rivers or anywhere else that has an early season stonefly hatch. They're great to have on hand in a larger size. If you get into higher or more murkier water than you expected, they can function very well as a point fly in a nymph rig when that happens. And I will fish these kind of big. I'll fish them in a 12 and then all the way down to like a 16 or even an 18 sometimes, just to again switch things up. And if you're on a river that's got an early season stonefly hatch, these are a must have. Your next fly is the squirmy worm or the San Juan worm. Any worm pattern will do here because the squirmy and the San Juan, they're not just winter flies. We talk about them a lot during winter. We talked about them as junk flies. We did that in our junk flies episode, and they get a lot of love during that time of year, but I don't know if they're as appreciated as they should be for spring fishing, because if the river rises thanks to rain or runoff and the water gets a little off color, any of these worm patterns are great to toss at that point because worms are going to get pulled into the river during those rain and runoff events. It's all going to wash into the river. And I think both of these do a very good job of grabbing the attention, both with their movement and then the contrast in colors from that dark brown background of higher water. I will fish these a little bit bigger in spring, so like a 10 to a 12. Winter, sometimes I'm down to as small as a 14, just, a little bit smaller fly in winter. But spring, I'll go to 10 to 12 on both of these. And last, but certainly not least, is our 20-incher stonefly. This is a great little stonefly nymph that is wonderful for, again, those freestone rivers or any river that has an early season stonefly hatch like the Squala. I like the 20-incher stone because it's just a little bit different. Again, it's not a fly that I see fished an awful lot. A lot of the local rivers around me here, the guides use these a ton. But until I moved up here, I hadn't seen people really getting into this fly as much as I have here. So I think it's a great little fly to, again, have on hand just to switch things up because the fish have seen an absolute parade of Pat's rubber legs and giant hare's ears that sometimes that 20-incher coming in, just again, it's just different enough that the fish will go for it at that point. And that wraps up our list. But if you're worried about trying some of these flies because they're a bit different from your normal selection and you think the trout might turn their noses up at them, well, I've got something for you. Alex and I recently spent a day out on the water where once we had caught a fish on a certain nymph, that nymph was banned for us for the rest of the day. Neither of us could use it. So if the first fish was caught on a zebra midge, neither of us could use a zebra midge for the rest of the day. It forced us to think outside the box and use flies that we normally wouldn't and pay attention to our presentation even more than we normally do. I was worried when we started this little experiment out that the fishing would be terrible. It would make for an awful video, that we wouldn't get anything that we wanted. But we ended up having a wonderful day, and Alex caught this absolutely gorgeous brown, his new personal best brown, actually, just a couple hours before we left. So as long as we got the presentation right, it seemed like the fish were more than willing to cooperate with our nymphs. Now, that may not always be the case, but this is a very important lesson to remember for spring, that often as long as you get the presentation right, they'll eat it. And sometimes you do need to make slight changes to fly selection because they've seen that Parachute Adams 1,000 times just today. They've seen it. They know that one's fake. They need something a little bit different. And that's why this list of flies exists. But if you want to learn more about that trip that we did, so you can see that process in action where we really were focusing just on presentation and catching fish on tons of different nymphs, I'll throw a link to that in the show notes for you. And that is going to wrap it up, though, for the open of the show. Thank you so much for being here, folks. But don't go anywhere. Don't touch that dial, is what I would say if this is a radio show, because we've got the Q&A section of this show coming right up.
Anglers are always asking, what bugs are hatching right now? And that's why we put together a year-round hatch chart. It outlines all the major bug hatches so you always know what fly to tie on, no matter where you're fishing or what time of the year. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this free hatch chart. All right, back to the show.
Every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, please go ahead and send those in to us. There's a link to submit those in the show notes. I love to get your questions. I love to hear from y'all. It's really fun to see where all our questions come from and just the variety of things that y'all are thinking about. And speaking of where they come from, our first question this week comes to us from Scotland. Ewan from Scotland writes in and says, "Hi, love the podcast. If you're fishing a dry dropper and there's a couple of fish rising, but not many, and you're not having any takes, would you change your dry fly first or your dropper first or both? Thanks very much." Ewan, thank you for the question. I appreciate it. In that situation, if the fish aren't rising with very much consistency, then there's probably not much of a hatch going on. This is one of my fatal flaws, though, in fly fishing. If I see a fish rise at all, I will cast to it with a dry fly, and I will continue to cast to it with a dry fly until I either put it down or catch it, or Alex drags me back to the truck because it's dark now. I'd probably catch a lot more fish if I didn't insist on being that way, but I just love fishing with dries so much. This is kind of how I am. So I recognize that as a problem, because in this situation where they're rising sporadically like this, your chances of catching them on a dry fly are pretty low. because if they're just rising sporadically, they're not feeding in a rhythm. They're just opportunistically eating. Now, you might be able to get something, but I've always found in those moments, your chances of catching something on the dry are a little bit lower. So what I would do in this situation is I'm going to switch to a nymph that I'm supremely confident in. And then my Dryfly essentially becomes an indicator at this point, but an indicator that you can actually catch a fish on, because the fish will come up and eat it. There's the odd chance that the fish will do that, so I keep the Dryfly on. If this was on my local creek and I ran into this situation, I would switch to a larger Dryfly up top, like a chubby Chernobyl, and then I would throw on a stonefly nymph underneath it, because the fish here absolutely adore stoneflies. And they're not really the biggest fan of the chubby, which is interesting. They'll eat other hopper patterns, but the chubby, it seems like they want the chubby a little bit smaller, which is just interesting. I've never found fish that seem to be that picky about their hopper patterns, but these ones are, for whatever reason. But in these situations, it's really about finding a balance between a fly that might still get eaten, but will effectively double as an indicator for your nymph. So it might need to be stout and floaty enough to float that nymph, especially if you choose a heavier one. Again, if the fish are rising sporadically though, and there are bugs on the water, then that means it's probably time to tie an emerger on. So ditch the nymph entirely and tie an emerger on, because those sporadic rises might just be the few fish that are eating the adults, and most of them might be munching on emergers. So you do need to pay attention to that as well. But hopefully that wasn't too convoluted and it answered your questions. I appreciate it. Thank you. Gerald from Arkansas has got our next question, writes in and says, what flies are categorized as mayflies? Gerald, thank you for this question. So the major aquatic insects that make up a fish's diet are your mayflies, your midges, your caddis, and your stoneflies. Each of those is a type of insect that spends a portion of its life in the water, but then it hatches and mates outside of the water. Then they return to the water to lay their eggs and die. Mayflies are one species of aquatic insect, and they're characterized by their tall, upright wings. And when you see them sitting on the water, they look like little sailboats on the water. I think I mentioned that earlier in the show. So that's a very defining characteristic of your mayflies, along with their very long, slender bodies. They're a graceful looking bug. Their silhouette's very classic. It's probably most closely associated with fly fishing than any other aquatic insect. It's got a very graceful look to it. Now, some of the major mayfly hatches that come off will be your blue-winged olives, your pale morning duns, any of the drakes, hexagenia mayflies, all of the quill species like the quill gordons, your March browns, your calabatus, and then tricos. That's not a comprehensive list. That's just some of the mayfly hatches that come off. And these mayflies will all start hatching at different times of the year, and some are a lot more prevalent in certain places than others. I was just talking to a friend of mine last week who lives out on the East Coast, and he asked me if we get any Hendricksons out here where I live. And we don't. We don't get very many Hendricksons out here, if any at all. Most of our mayflies that go through the summer tend to be our pale morning duns. And then we do get a drake hatch that lasts for quite a bit, actually. Quite a long drake hatch out here. So that's just one example of how it really can differ from region to region here in the country. Now, we actually have an in-depth video about mayflies that I'll link in the show notes for you, so you can go learn more about them. And then I also just did a podcast about mayflies as well, so I'll link that if you really want to take your deep dive and learn everything there is to know about mayflies. Hopefully those two resources can help you out. And I really appreciate the question. Thank you. Tyler from Canada has our next question, writes in and says, here in Alberta, I fish the Big Bow River, but also some mountain streams. My question is, I have a 9-foot 5-weight rod, but I want to throw bigger streamers and cast the heavy nymph rigs. I also have an old 8-foot 6-7 weight rod. So should I buy a new reel for that with a sink tip line, or buy a second reel for my 5 weight that has a sink tip line? Tyler, good question. Thank you very much. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the sink tip line that you bring up, because some folks may not know, but some fly lines are made with a tip section of usually around 10 to 20 feet that is designed to sink. Now, these lines are great for fishing streamers or even swinging some wet flies, but they get your flies down deep. But since only the tip sinks, it gives you more control over the depth. You can work that depth a little bit more. This is very ideal on a river since you're not fishing at a consistent depth all the time like you often are on still water. So I don't use sink tip lines for nymphs. It might sound like a good idea. You think, oh, that's awesome. Gets my flies down. I don't have to use any weight. That's great. But what the sink tip line will do with your nymphs is completely eliminate your ability to fill like 90% of the eats, because all of that's underwater. The fly line itself is not very sensitive compared to your tippet and your leader. And then if the tip of your line is sunk completely underwater, that means your leader has sunk, which means your strike indicator is also underwater at that point. So don't use them for nymphs. The streamers, wet flies, that's where your sink tip lines shine. So to answer the rest of your question, if you are looking to throw larger streamers, then I would recommend just using the rod you have, that 6-7 weight, but get a 6 weight sink tip line. The reason a 6 weight such a great choice for streamers is that, again, we go back to our concept of fly casting. 6 weight lines are heavier than 5 weight lines. And in fly casting, we are actually casting the line. We're not casting the fly itself. So the heavier line that you have, the heavier fly you'll be able to throw. A 1 weight line does not have the mass to create enough energy to carry your 2-aught meat whistle streamer, for example. But a 6 weight has that mass, has that ability to throw that. And then it's a good idea. Again, I like what you said about getting an extra spool, because you can carry an extra spool for your reel with you, and you can have a full sink line on that spool, or you can get a sink tip line on it and then a floating line on the other spool. So then when you're out and about, you don't have to carry 2 rods. If you want to switch over to streamers throughout the day, you can just swap the spools out, throw on your sink tip, and be good to go. So hopefully that helps. I appreciate the question. Thank you. Russell from Missouri has our next question, writes in and says, I fish streams that have stocked trout in them. Do these stocked fish react to bugs the same as wild trout? I'm using a 9-foot 5/6 weight rod. I'm thinking of using soft hackles or midges, but if I see trout rising, I might try a Dryfly. I love the podcast and find them very educational. Thanks, and keep the podcast coming. Thank you, Russell. I really appreciate that. We've had this question about stocked versus wild fish a lot lately, so I wanted to answer it again here, and then I want to ask y'all a question as well. Would there be interest in the VFC audience in a podcast that's dedicated to stocked versus wild trout? Let me know in the comments what y'all think about that, because if the interest is there, I will definitely put that show together for you. But the short answer to your question is that yes, stocked fish will react the same. You don't need special flies for them. You don't need special techniques for them. In fact, they will take just about anything regardless of the presentation, because stocked fish have different behavior than wild fish, because they have spent their entire life getting fed by pellets that drop on top of the water in the concrete runs and the hatcheries that they lived in. So they are used to looking up for their food. They're used to a lot of disturbance on the water when their food gets to them. So your dry flies with less than an ideal presentation will catch planted fish much more effectively than they will wild fish, because the wild fish have spent their entire life being a little bit wary of the topwater eats. Planted fish, again, they didn't grow up with that, so that they don't have that instilled into them. They'll wise up eventually, and they won't just throw themselves at anything. But if you're there a couple of days after they've been planted in the river, then you really don't have to worry about your presentation too much. Now, that doesn't say get lazy with your presentation. Make sure you're doing as good a job as you can. But they are much more forgiving planted fish are. Now, as far as your fly selection goes, the best advice I have on that is to make sure that you're imitating the real life bugs that you see out on the water. That is going to be your goal to success as a fly angler, no matter what species you're fishing for or where you're fishing for them. You want to imitate the food that the fish are most likely going to eat. So that means you're going to take some time to observe what's on, in, or around the water before you fish. Take a minute to look. Are there bugs buzzing in the air? Are there bugs on the water? Are the fish rising to eat those bugs? If not, turn over some rocks in the river. Look at the bugs that are underneath them. Pull those rocks out and match the bugs you see on the bottom of the rock to the fake bugs that you've got in your fly box. And then we have this entire system here at VFC called the Right Fly Formula. It's a fly selection process where we tell you that basically you want to match size first, then shape, then color when you're imitating real life bugs. And we could spend an entire podcast on this topic, and we have multiple times. So I'm not going to go crazy into it here, but if you want more detail on that, we actually have an entire fly selection masterclass, which I will link in the show notes, that goes through everything about picking the right fly for every aquatic insect. I highly recommend you take a look at that. And then just to wrap up, I'm not exactly sure what it's like in Missouri, but I would imagine this time of year, probably pretty good dry dropper fishing. So you can put your dry fly up top and then throw a nymph below it like a zebra midge. Since you mentioned midges, sounds like it might be a confidence fly for you. This gives you a chance to catch something on the dry fly, which I highly recommend because it is the most fun that you can legally have in at least 37 states. But then you still have the nymph, which sounds like, again, it might be a confidence fly of yours, so you're feeling really good about that setup. Dry dropper rigs are how I fish most of the time. They're a great way to cover two parts of the water column, and they're effective everywhere from big rivers to small streams. I really appreciate that question, and that does it for the Q&A section of the show this week. But don't go anywhere, folks, because the Live Real Life moment is coming up. Every week, we end the show by sharing stories and pictures from those of you in the VFC audience who are out there living real life. I love to see these stories and to hear them from you guys, so please keep sending those in. There's a link to submit your own Live Real Life moment in the show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Joseph. Writes in and says, "My brothers and I don't get to fish together very often due to life just being busy. We made it happen this last weekend, though. Of my 4 brothers there, I was the only one who really knows how to fly fish. One is just starting to learn, and the other 2 were using spinner rods. It became quickly apparent that where we were fishing, flies were the fish's meal of choice because all the fish were being caught on the fly rods. This got my 2 brothers with spinner rods interested in trying to fly fish for the first time. So I swapped rods with them and gave them a crash course on how to rig up, cast, mend, read water, etc. All the good stuff I have learned from VFC. After they got the hang of it, I let them at it and took one of their rods for a spin. It was my first time using a spinner rod in years. Ironically, after the spinners being skunked for 2 days, I quickly hooked into the largest rainbow of the whole trip. A 20-inch rainbow with beautiful colors caught with a domino on a spinner rod. I'm still counting it as a new PB. Wish I had got it on the fly, though. It was a great trip, and I'm excited that it appears to have turned a couple of my brothers on to fly fishing. Looking forward to getting back out with them and continuing to live real life." Joseph, that's awesome. That is such a great story. Oh, yeah, that sounds like an absolute blast. I'm so glad you guys had that opportunity to go out there and have those experiences as brothers and just make that happen. It's so tough to pull that off, and it feels like it shouldn't be, but you're right. Life just gets so stupid busy, and then it's hard to make time for the family stuff that we know we should. So I really appreciate you sending that question in, or not that question, that story in. That Live Real Life moment was wonderful. Thank you. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the show this week. Thank you so much for being here with us, listening to the end. That helps us more than you know. And if you could, take a minute to rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it, because the more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live real life, which is what we are all about here at VFC. We want you to have the best day possible on the water. And in addition to this podcast, we've got a bunch of other awesome content that can help you out as well. You can check out links to it wherever you see them. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, enjoy yourselves, catch a few fish, and live real life.